If you're following the news on really anything at this point, then there's a pretty good chance that you're feeling overwhelmed. I know that I've spent a lot of time this year feeling climate anxiety and climate grief. And if there's any one book that has helped me more than any other book, it is Facing the Climate Emergency by Margaret Klein Salamon. And she's a clinical psychologist, and that book really helped me deal with the crisis on an emotional level, and it helped me figure out how to take action. Recently had the opportunity to have a conversation with her about the book, and without further ado, here's that. Okay, so first, thanks so much for being here. I'm happy to have you on. And I want to ask you a bit about your path towards recognizing that we're in a climate emergency. I mean, I think everybody has their own individual story, and I feel like I would love to hear yours.
Right.
If that's not too personal.
No, of course I know. That's why I wrote this book. So I have always been a humanities person, not really interested in science. Sorry. Um, and I really was in a kind of denial, willful ignorance about the climate emergency for many years. I knew enough to know that I didn't want to know more, so I avoided it. But and studied anthropology in college, and then got my PhD in clinical psychology. And again, because I love people and they're so fascinating to me, and especially being able to help. But I moved to New York to get my PhD. And while I living here, Hurricane Irene happened, or
Right.
Hurricane Sandy happened, and it just started my kind of anxiety and stress, terror about this emergency started to kind of just grow and grow to the point where it felt like a blaring red light in my
Yeah.
face. And yeah, I decided I had to, I couldn't go on. I couldn't go on with even the lovely career of clinical psychology.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it seems like you came to that conclusion. I mean, I guess you have a psychology background, so it took you maybe less time than it takes a lot of people. I know for me, it was like I came at it from a science lens, from a scientific perspective. And even after knowing what the facts were, it was so hard to like break through to that reality. You called it, what did you call it? Willful ignorance. And that's like, I feel like what everybody is in or is going through.
And yeah, and intellectualization, where
Yeah.
you know it in your mind, but like not your heart or plans or values, and also, yeah, compartmentalization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
oh yeah, that's real. It's just, separate from
yeah.
me.
Or it's like, yeah, it's happening somewhere else far away, or it's happening to children that are yet to be born,
Right.
you
Polar
know?
bears, future generations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, and maybe you'll agree with this, a lot of that is the fault of the media and our education system. And like, I mean, I think that there's a lot to blame for that, right? Like you mentioned polar bears, and we were talking about climate change as something that affects polar bears for decades, right? And now people are starting to realize, no, like this is affecting us, like everyone alive now. Um, yeah. You talk about, so the book is about facing the climate emergency, and you talk about switching from political paralysis. Yeah, it's an excellent book, and I'm so excited to share it with the viewers, with you. I hope people will read it. Um, but yeah, you talk about switching from political paralysis to into emergency mode. And I think that this is something that I've been slowly coming to terms with, like that we need to treat the climate not as some faraway crisis, but as something now. And I hadn't ever heard someone use that language before. And it made a lot of sense to me. So I don't know, can you just expand on like what that really means?
Yeah. So in 2015, I wrote a paper called Leading the Public into Emergency Mode, a new strategy for the climate movement. And it talks about, and I also continue talking about this in the book, but that there is just a fundamental difference between normal mode and emergency mode. There's a difference in what you think about and how your mind works, how your body works, even, right? People are capable of doing things in an emergency that like shouldn't even be possible.
Yeah, like lifting cars off of people.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it's just resource allocation is different, self-esteem sources are different. It's just fundamentally different. And one of the metaphors that I use is, imagine if your house is on fire. What do you think about? What are your priorities? How do you distribute your resources, right? Everything goes towards putting out the fire. It's like an obvious question, right? They're like, oh, but what about like your secondary priorities? It's like, no, your house is burning down. And so that when you enter this emergency mode as an individual, like you said, it's, picking up the car. It turns out that we can do incredible things, both as people and as a country. So I use the example of World War II, in which we transformed our economy in just a few years from a consumer economy to, the greatest production of war material that like so far beyond what anybody thought was possible, and arming ourselves and our allies and winning the war. So that's and the way that we did it is by deciding that we were going to do it, because if we didn't, nothing else mattered.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was like, it's kind of hard to imagine. I mean, given now what's happening with COVID and how there's, I would say, a very light response. And I mean, I'm in Canada, but I would say a lot of countries are having a very slow and I guess half solutions sorts of solutions. It's like, oh, we'll recommend this, but we won't make masks mandatory. And I think that if you look back on World War II and how the United States acted, it was like, no, we're going to make it so that you can't produce new cars, and we're going to ration meat, and we're going to ration all sorts of things. And that's like almost fundamentally difficult to imagine that was not that long ago that took place. Right.
Right.
And it's like, that is possible. Yeah.
These are considered like third rail issues in environmentalism, right? I mean, especially rationing, but even just like we can ban stuff. We don't have to just incentivize people not to use harmful and murderous practices. We can just ban them. And so I love how that went down in World War II. I think it's such a great example. And the same with government spending is, we believe that the government should spend without limit to save as much life as possible. And I mean, I know that's kind of, the way we're taught to think about what's possible is through financial constraints, right? Can we afford it?
Yeah.
But we need to make these systems, including the financial system, work for us towards our goal of, getting out of this absolutely horrible emergency.
I feel like as time goes, we see fewer and fewer arguments that make sense against taking action on climate. Because I remember even just like a year ago, it was like, oh yeah, the climate that's a big problem, but it would cost a lot of money to solve that. And then like just this year, America was like, hey, well, we're going to spend trillions of dollars fighting this COVID pandemic because we actually have these levels of resources, and we're not accepting that it's an emergency, right? That climate is an emergency.
And we're shutting down huge portions of the economy to protect life, right?
Yeah.
But because life is more important. And it's so, even though the U.S. response has obviously been a shambles, even so, I think we've really seen some important lessons about this idea of emergency functioning and what is possible when you activate that.
he talked about in the book a bit about how gradualism is over. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, for some context, I was born after the Berlin Wall fell, right? I was born in 1989. And in my lifetime, most of the emissions that have ever been emitted have been emitted in my lifetime, right? In the last 30 years. And and yet, like all of these things that we've been trying haven't stopped us from not even just from reduce. We haven't reduced our emissions, but we've also continued increasing our emissions year by year.
Absolutely.
And so when you talk about how gradualism is over, like what does that mean? Like I'd love if you could unpack that for people watching.
Yeah. So gradualism says the climate is a problem that should be dealt with over several decades, long time frame, through generally market-based mechanisms such as a carbon price that will cause the gradual decrease of emissions. And it's just too late. I mean, okay. So actually, two things. Two things. One, it's just too late. Two, it didn't work. This has been the approach of the environmental movement and the Democratic Party for decades, right? As long as we've been alive, as long as those emissions have gone up and up and up, and it's so I don't want to belittle the efforts of the individuals and organizations who fought for those approaches. If they had been implemented like 30 years ago, we'd probably be in a really different situation. But it's time's up. They didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think, hard for people to wrap their head around that every year as we emit more carbon, our timelines also get shorter and the amount that we need to do gets worse. It's like your metaphor from earlier. If the house is on fire, if it's like just a little fire in your, in your oven, then that's not a big deal, right? But we've waited until the point where it is like in every room now. And we can still save the building, but we have to really get our act together.
I really struggle. I like that, the fires in every room. I really struggle for how to describe the climate emergency in big enough terms. And it's always, I worry a little bit, whatever. I know to some people it might sound hyperbolic or Chicken Little or whatever. But I mean, this is the apocalypse, right? This is like everything terrible happening all at once. And we need to turn this around.
Yeah, I think I felt a lot of that kind of difficulty in being a science communicator. And, like it's like, well, is it ethical for me to compare this to this pandemic, right? I mean, this is a horrible situation. And I'm not trying to, by saying that climate change is worse, I'm not trying to belittle the situation that we're in. But it's like, if you look at the statistics, like if you look at the trends that we're heading towards, like climate change is orders of magnitude worse. It's many, many times worse. And I think that goes back to our willful ignorance that we're living in, right? Like, of course, it sounds like Chicken Little. It sounds alarmist for you to say that because no one else is telling the truth. Yeah.
Right. Humans are a social animal. This is how we evaluate like everything, right? Is looking to our friends and family and neighbors and colleagues and the media and just what is going on. And it's hard to actually tell the truth about this because it's so big, it's so uncomfortable, it can be controversial, it can be, somebody, sometimes when I talk about the climate emergency, I feel guilty. I feel guilty for inflicting the suffering on the other person. And because again, we're social. That's just, we're hardwired that and it's not, I mean, it's a good thing and a bad thing, but we're hardwired so that in that interaction, it feels so important what the other person is experiencing. And so to cause them some, pain, some unpleasant experiences. It feels like, oh gosh, sorry, but it's we just have to get past the awkwardness and those those feelings, because just telling the truth is more important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, I think you summarized that really well. I feel like the idea of shooting the messenger has often come to my mind when I don't mean, I don't, and I also think like when you're telling people the truth, I think it can be hard for them to understand that you're not trying to make them feel guilty. We're all involved in creating emissions, but like I think the message of this is about your carbon footprint and this is about what you can personally do in your actions as an individual. I think that that's so ingrained that it feels like I'm insulting people when I say that we need to do something for the climate. And I think that people are just starting to, as we saw, last year with all of the Fridays for Future marches and with Extinction Rebellion becoming a thing the year before that. I think we're starting to get people on the train that collective action is what we need. Um, I would love for you to talk. I mean, you have a whole section in your book called "Join the Climate Emergency Movement." Would love to hear from you a bit about like how people can get involved and what that might look like. I know it looks different for everyone, but
Yeah, great. Before I say that, let me just say, I God, the carbon footprint and like individual responsibility through consumer choice, that narrative has just been devastating for the climate movement. And, not surprisingly, BP put a lot of money into it because it's perfect for them, right? Like, don't look at us. We're just meeting the demands of all of your carbon footprints. Um, so
yeah, I talked a bit about that in my last video actually because it was like, I put together a whole video on my carbon footprint and what that looked like. And then I tried to do at the end, like, and this is why it doesn't make any sense to focus on carbon footprints because, it was like popularized by BP and they understood, what the implications of that would be. So
that
yeah,
if
there's a
that
video
if
on
that
that
if
somewhere.
that if each of us feels that since we live in this system and therefore it's our fault and therefore we don't have the standing to say this has to change, because they're saying, oh well, how did you get here? Did you come in a car? Did you look at your kayak that's made of plastic, whatever, like it's so just to be really clear, uh as I say in the book, this is not our fault. This is not nobody watching the video, right? This is not your fault, but it is your and our responsibility to deal with this because no one else is.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a conversation with someone a while ago, and they were saying, like Curtis, this is your choice to. I mean, obviously, like climate and the climate crisis is making you depressed, right? And I was going through a lot, and they're like, it's your choice to be focusing on this. Like, it's your choice to make this your life's work. You don't have to do this. And my response is like, I wish I had a choice, but it's either I do something or I mean, I'm facing a catastrophe, right? And if I have the chance to live a long life, then I'll be regretting not acting sooner. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate those words. So what can people do on that note in terms of being involved in the movement?
Right. We've talked about what not to do, or not to focus on anyway. But what is going to change the world is organizing, right? So the first thing that every single person should do is talk about the climate emergency, break the silence. It's can be emotionally challenging, but in another sense, it's very easy, right? You can do it today. Um, and just people feel intimidated. They're not, I'm not a scientist, whatever. That's okay. You don't need to give a PowerPoint, just ask, hey, what do you think is going to happen in the next several decades? Do you follow you can ask your friend, do you follow the climate emergency? Did you see that Siberia was 100 degrees? Like, what is that? How, what do you make of that? How does that make you feel? Tell them how you feel. Because I personally have been freaking out and really immensely concerned. And what you will be surprised to find a significant amount of the time is people that will say, oh God, I thought I was the only one.
I've had
I
that
mean,
conversation so many times.
yes,
I mean,
it's,
people, like, especially young people are freaking out. Like, I remember there's a stat, I think it's in your book, about how 80% of young people believe that, climate change is going to be disastrous within their lifetime. But then, like, only 15% of people talk about it on a regular basis. It's just like mind blowing, right?
it's
Um,
really, really bad.
yeah, it's the worst sort of taboo, one that is like, enabling a crisis for sure.
Right. So,
But
right,
I've experienced that.
we're all sitting in a burning house, but everybody feels so much social pressure not to mention it
This
that
is fine.
that, that we're not making a plan because nobody wants to like ruin the party. But like, guys, we have to talk about this.
Yeah.
So that's step one. And step two is to join the climate emergency movement, which, unlike gradualism, is a movement that tells the truth about the climate emergency and demands a rapid elimination of greenhouse gas emissions. The climate mobilization, the organization that I founded, calls for zero emissions by 2030. That's what the Green New Deal calls for. Extinction Rebellion calls for zero emissions by 2025. This is better, right? Like, I mean, we should have eliminated emissions like 20 years ago, but if we didn't. So in lieu of that, we need to do it like right now. So that's what the climate emergency movement calls for. The school strikers, and there's a lot of the environmental justice movement, like at Standing Rock. There is a different type of movement happening. It's different in communications, it's different in demands, it's different in tactics. And yeah, it's coming up everywhere. So you can either join something that's already happening in your area, or if you, as this is happening less and less, but if you live somewhere where they don't have a sunrise or a climate mobilization or an extinction rebellion, school strikes, you can start one. And just shifting your focus to the movement and to politics. There's so many different things that can be done there. So like another good example is to get involved in political campaigns for climate emergency candidates at any level, right? Local, state, national. And you can door knock, and you can be a volunteer campaign manager, and you can, you can be a volunteer graphic designer. You can have a fundraiser in your home. There's truly an unlimited a number of ways to be involved, and it's very personal, right? It's kind of like choosing a career, but the most so in facing the climate emergency, I talk about a bunch of different considerations. How many hours can you give? Are you willing to get arrested? Do you have special skills? Are you willing to fundraise? I think more people are willing to get arrested than they are to fundraise, by the way.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book how like pretty much every organization needs people that are into fundraising. So yeah.
So it's about finding your place. No one can tell you what your place is, but you can, if you say, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to figure out how to make the biggest contribution I can to this movement. You'll find it, and you start by showing up. Just start showing up to meetings, and just be willing to help. Yeah, sure, I'll take notes. Yeah, I can do. I can sign up for that. Whatever, and you can grow into a leadership role, and together we save the world.
Yeah. In your book, I think you said the most important thing is just to get started. And that was like, oh yeah, of course. And it's actually really simple. And like I mean, and especially in your book, you lay out such a like clear step-by-step like guide to what makes sense to do it like for you, like whoever you are, whatever your skills are. Um, and I just found that like really inspiring and empowering. Yeah, because that's what it all comes down to, right? It's like we're all just people. We need to do our best, and we need to use our skills in the best possible way. And there's so much out there. There's so many options, like you mentioned, the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, school strike. There's so many things that it can almost be overwhelming. But just pick one and get started, right? I thought you said that really well in the book. And on that, maybe it would be a good place to leave with saying, if you're watching this, there's a link to Margaret's book in the Facing the Climate Emergency in the description. So just go get yourself a copy.
People who are interested but not quite ready to commit can download a free chapter, the first chapter of Facing the Climate Emergency at facingtheclimateemergency.com.
Awesome. And where should people follow you?
Twitter at Climate Psych.
And I'll put that in the description as well. And thank you so much for being on here on the channel.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.